Throughout the ages, there have been many tales, myths, and legends passed down from generation to generation. Stories of a massive humanoid bipedal creature that is covered in hair, sometimes deep in the forest, sometimes in broad daylight, and sometimes even in your own backyard. They go by many names and mean many different things to other cultures. Their existence has been hotly debated from both sides of the aisle. In the following video, I will present to you stories of alleged encounters, and then you can decide for yourself, is Bigfoot real? Our first story takes place in a late 1970s Alaskan summer in Fairbanks County. I was a part of a group of about a dozen Army personnel training in the area. It was summer on a warm, clear day, and we were above the tree line and had been camped there for several days. I was looking across the nearest valley when I spotted movement. It was on the base of a steep mountain in bare, rocky terrain with snowfields descending down in the small gullies on the hillside. It was moving up the valley about half a mile away. When it crossed the snow, you could plainly see that it was not a bear. It walked upright with long strides and had arms swinging and moved fast across the white snow. It was dark in color like a bear, but I have seen many bears many times since in the same type of terrain, and they do not move like this did. It was too big and too fast to be a human. Bears can and do walk upright, but usually for short distances when they need to see or smell something and need the height. They don't travel in this manner, and especially not in difficult terrain. I pointed out to the other guys, and we watched it until you could no longer see it. When it was out of the snow, it was hard to see against the rocks. We wanted to go look for it and look for the tracks, but everyone was too scared to go down there, and we even had to sleep there that night, and nobody would go outside after dark. The next day we got out and we never went back. 20 years later, I still would not go up there even with a group that had guns. The only thing that I have seen that looked like this is the descriptions of a Bigfoot. In later years, I was telling a friend about this, and he said he found tracks in the sand in Alaska out by king salmon. He said they were over 2 feet long, but looked kind of human. He has a lot of outdoor experience here, and says that there were in no way the tracks of a bear. This was also in a remote area, and you couldn't see other people, only in planes. Some other details noted about the location are Alaska Richardson Highway, south of Delta Junction, in Black Rapids Glacier. This next story takes place in the late spring of 2004, near Idlewild, California, in Riverside County. I was camping with my 7-year-old son on top of Mount San Jacinto, specifically in the Round Valley. This was the 3rd year we had done this, and the plan was to spend the night at 9,200 feet and do the peak the next day. Spend another night in Round Valley, and then go back down the mountain on the 3rd day. The place we set camp was on the southeast side of Round Valley, with some large granite boulders to give us some shelter if the wind picked up. Surrounding our camp were Ponderosa and Jeffrey Pines, and not too far away was a small stream. This was early June, and there were still some snowdrifts in the shaded places. My son and I had eaten dinner and were getting ready for bed at about 10 p.m. We were in our sleeping bags but still talking and planning the trip to the peak in the morning. Suddenly, without warning, we heard a loud, low-pitched whooping call in the boulders just above us. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my son asked me if it was a monkey, and not wanting to deal with a panicked 7-year-old, I just told him it was an owl. We didn't smell or hear any footsteps. Didn't smell anything or hear any footsteps. Everything calmed down and we finally fell asleep. About an hour later, I heard a loud boom that sounded close to the tent. I looked out the window in the tent and saw a few clouds in the moonlight, so I pulled our boots into the tent in case we got a thunderstorm that night. The next morning, we got up and had breakfast and then headed for the peak. We made the peak, but by the time we got back to camp, my knees were swollen and sore, so I put some snow in a sandwich bag for an ice pack that evening to reduce the swelling for the trip out the next morning. The night was pretty uneventful, and we slept well in the high altitude air. The next morning, we get up and begin to pack for a trip to off the mountain. I went up on top of the boulders to make sure that none of the trash had blown away from the camp, to make sure everything was picked up. Then I saw what had made the loud boom the night before. The night before last, that is, 30 yards from our tent, on top of the boulders, was an 8-inch in diameter ponderosa pine, snapped off at the base. The tree was still green and fresh and had no rot in it whatsoever, and there was no wind to speak of, really, either night. The only explanation I can come up with is that the animal that made the whooping sound had pushed over the tree, and the tree was not aimed in the direction of our tent, rather parallel to the direction of our tent was pitched. I don't think the animal was trying to do any harm, but it may just have been trying to express dominance. To add a comment of my own, in a story like this, I would never be able to sleep after something like that. Like, I've been camping before, and if I hear if I hear a deer in the trees, I'm up all night. I'm not a good camper. So whenever I hear stories about someone actually being able to sleep after something like this happens, I definitely commend them, because I would not be able to do that. Everything in me would want me to get the hell out of there. This takes place during the summer of 1990 in California, in Riverside County, near Idlewild once again. It's been 12 years. I remember it was in the Dutchman's Flats near Idlewild. We were camped maybe a mile off one of the trailheads. And this is a bit of a late report, but however, it's still a valid one. What prompted this report is the fact that I now currently reside in Snohomish County, Washington, and just read about local sightings in my area, and I was surprised at the number of reports. I used to live in Orange County, California, and an old girlfriend of mine and I were camping up in Dutchman's Flats area near Idlewild. We were out packing, but not in a campground. We were awakened by screams that resembled the sound of a pack of coyotes that had just made a kill, but right outside of our tent. The screams, however, had a bit of a deeper tone than a coyote. At the time, it was what we thought it was, so we stayed quiet, not wanting to interrupt a wild animal's meal. The screams and screeches continued on for what seemed like an hour, but it was likely only 5 or 10 minutes. The screams stopped, but we could hear what sounded like heavy footsteps right outside the door to our tent. We could hear sniffing sounds and heavy breathing. That's when I got really scared. I know a coyote does not step like a 300-plus pound man in combat boots. I was too scared to even turn on my flashlight to take a look, thinking maybe it was a bear that had just run off and what we thought were coyotes. We stayed up, paralyzed, all night with fear until the sun came up. Even then, there was still a dead silence. No birds, no crickets, no nothing. I was still scared to go outside, but I eventually did. I could see that something was in our camp due to the scattering of pine needles and dirt around our tent. But there was no sign of a coyote kill, no blood, no fur laying around. But what I did see was a pair of big, deep footprints going away from our site and down into a deeply wooded ravine. The thing, whatever it was, walked upright and had a 3 to 4 foot gait. I followed the steps for a few yards down into the ravine while my girlfriend watched. It was still deathly quiet, and I had this eerie feeling that I was still being watched. The footprints led right into the thicket, and I could see it was a wide path left by whatever it was. I turned and ran back up the hill, packed up our stuff, and in a big hurry, we left. At the time, I was in my early 20s. I'm now in my late 30s, and I take my wife and kids camping all the time up here in Washington, but I do it with a new respect for nature now. This one's a bit of a shorter video, but I hope you still enjoyed it. And if you do like what I do, then please consider subscribing, because on my analytics, it's pretty brutal. I think it's something like 94% of people who watch these things are like not subscribed. Either way, I only got 200 subscribers, so I'm not too broken up by that. But it'd be great to get to 2,000, and then I could actually make improvements to what I do, because I would know that people really do like these things. But anyways, what do you think? Is Bigfoot real? I'll probably continue this series, or I want to make it a series. I'll continue it in the future. That is, if you like them. Even if you don't, I'm still going to do them. It doesn't matter to me. But anyways, have a good night. I hope you're all set up for the holidays. And I hope that whenever you see one of my videos that you'll pull up a stump and you'll sit and have a listen. Have a good night.